Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be doing a full legendary tier list. I know the pictures at the bottom are a little bit awkwardly cut. I should probably have cut out the artwork of each legendary specifically. However, I'm far too lazy to do that for every single legendary out there, so I've just imported the images and threw them into the tier maker so I can do this list. So I do apologize about that. However, the topic that I want to be covering today is that a lot of people seem to think that most of the legendaries are mandatory in order to play Flesh and Blood properly. However, I don't think that is fully the case. Like, a lot of these legendaries, they are of course the top pick in the format in general. However, they do have some very good alternatives available to them. So I'm going to be separating these into mandatory, like cards that really have no alternative at all, cards that are pretty much S tier legendaries but that do have alternatives available to them, and then the decent, bad, and the straight up don't play legendaries. So I'm just going to go down the line like as they are displayed here. So let's see. First of all, the Spirit of Irina. It's a new card. It got released in Dynasty. It's a great card in Bolton. Do I think that it is mandatory? It's not mandatory per se. However, it is a very good card because it makes the Luminous Ascensions instant speed. What that means is that if you can set up a Spirit very early on as a Bolton player and you do draw into your combo, you no longer have that issue that you need to have 2 or 3 things in your soul already, because you can play a Luminescent instant speed in order to generate a bunch of action points. So it becomes a lot safer to be able to go in with all your Centauri Sabers like 6 to 8 times in that turn without your opponent being able to block that out. So it's a great card. I don't think it's mandatory. You can still play Bolton combo perfectly fine without it. I do suggest, however, if you're gonna be a Bolton player, to pick this up soon, especially the cold foil, because that one doesn't curve and cannot get you infractions at big events for having a marked card. However, it's cheap enough to pick it up now, so I would say definitely pick it up. It's a really good addition to the Bolton deck, and but it's not mandatory. So for Assassin, the Black Deck Whisperers, I think this card is definitely mandatory. Being able to constantly bring it back with your silver tokens is just extremely powerful. I do feel, however, that it's more so mandatory in the CC format than it is in the Blitz format, because generally speaking in Blitz you only really want go again for something like once or twice in the entire game, and I still feel it's very awkward that these boots don't give a guaranteed go again, that you need to use it as a instant in order to, like, you need to use it as a reaction, and that's something that the opponent can very easily reply to with a defense reaction that can completely blank out this card altogether, which is something I'm not really happy with. I kind of wish they were more like the warrior boots, the common that if you hit with an attack that you can break these and then get go again, but it is what it is. Maybe they would have been a little bit too overpowered, because over the course of a long game these do generate you quite a bit of value by just being able to block 1 damage, bring it back, blocking another damage, bringing it back, etc, etc. So I do think they are mandatory for the Assassin playstyle in CC. In Blitz they are great, but I would probably say that a Snapdragon Skills is also quite good. So for Prism is Living Legend in CC, so right now we only see the new legendary over in the Blitz format. The name of it escapes me. I think it's called Soraya, Invoke Soraya, something like that. But from what I've seen is that this card is doing very well for the Blitz players out there. So is it mandatory? I think the general, like, Prism playstyle is more centered around auras at the moment. It's not really that much Herald aggro right now, so it's not a mandatory card, but it's a very strong card to have for Prism. So if you're playing Prism and Blitz, you can always pick this up later, but I think this is a great card, but it's not mandatory, so we're going to be putting it in the great section. The Crown of Seeds is definitely a mandatory card in the CC format. It's not usable in Blitz, so I cannot put it here in general, but in CC this really makes the whole all-team control playstyle possible. Without this card, I don't think all-team would do as well as it is right now, because being able to filter a card in your arsenal, like getting rid of a bad card to potentially replace it with something that you do need, is very powerful. And then also being able to stop that 1 damage really stops a lot of those really awkward breakpoints, especially if you combine that with something like a Fiendel Spring Tunic, because then you can pay for this, cycle a card, and start your turn with a 5-card hand, which is just so extremely potent. It's just sickening good. So, sorry, the Heart of Ice is up next. I like this because it has Arcane Barrier built into it, and it also really punishes the wizard heroes if you activate it at the beginning of your turn. It kind of puts them into a position that they need to commit straight away, which makes it a lot easier for you to decide if you want to stop whatever they are doing, because once the effect goes off, it becomes a lot harder for them. I do think, however, I don't consider this an S tier legendary. It's really good. I would even want to put it in great because of its very powerful anti-wizard effect. However, I don't think it's mandatory to have this. If you are a starting player, you can very easily just get like a Null Rune Robe instead, because then you still have the Arcane Barrier, you just don't have this activation available to you, which is perfectly fine. You'll be able to play the game just fine without this legendary. So, next up, what's the name of this? This is called Shock Charmers. Yeah, it should be the Shock Charmers. These are really nice. Like, on the one hand, you can use these to generate a bunch of advantage with like little pings of damage, which is very useful, especially in Blitz if your opponent is very close to lethal, because it forces them to overblock stuff that they don't want to overblock. But the best thing about this card is the Spell Void 2. I like Spell Void 2 especially in Blitz, because what it allows you to do is you can bring Arcane Barrier tree, like the headpiece, the chest piece, and the boots, and then also bring your Spell Void 2. And because of that, you get into situations like if an Icelander, for example, wants to use an Aether Ice Vein red, which deals 5 damage, you can very easily pitch a blue to stop 3 of the damage, and then use the Spell Void to stop that additional 2 damage, which can save you a full card in your hand during any of your turns in Blitz, which is extremely powerful. Again though, this card, it's great, but I don't think it's really mandatory to have as a Runeblade or a Ranger player, so therefore it is great. The Spell Void is very good, however, again, it's not a mandatory card. And I think this is a theme for a lot of the legendaries out there. I think people are putting too much of an emphasis that the legendaries are necessary to play the game. However, they're not. There's a lot of very budget alternatives out there right now, and you should take full advantage of that. There is a lot of comments, a lot of rares and stuff that can almost imitate what these things can do, and sometimes even have an upside in comparison to the legendaries. So a lot of them are going to end up in the great, but not the mandatory tiers. So next up, the Crown, well, what's called, it's not the Crown of Providence, it's the Crown of Dominion. Yeah, that should be it. The Crown of Dominion. I haven't really seen a single deck that really utilizes this deck properly. I guess in a warrior deck you could potentially use the gold token to be able to pay for a cash in order to get 2 cards for basically 1, which kind of turns this into a potential like a Pot of Greed in Yu-Gi-Oh terms. So it's decent, like you can definitely build around it in a more currency emphasized deck. However, I don't think it's really, it's not really that great. Like there are legendaries out there like the Crown of Dominion over here. No, not Crown of Dominion. The Crown, I keep on throwing all the crown names. I keep mixing them up. I'm very sorry about that. But the Crown of Providence, for example, this one blocks 2. It cycles a card from your arsenal or your hand for a different card. I feel that effect is just so much more powerful than the Crown of Dominion. Am I now mixing up like Crown Providence, Crown? Yeah, I'm correct. And it's so much more powerful than the Crown of Dominion that I feel like this is just a legendary that I almost feel is mandatory to have because it blocks 2, it helps you to cycle a card, it helps you to set up. However, they do have a budget alternative available to it, which is another legendary in this list, which is the Arcanite Skullcap. Don't get me wrong, Arcanite Skullcap is still a kind of expensive card. However, this one blocks 3 while this one blocks 2 and cycles a card. So these two are almost equal to each other, and on top of that you can have the Arcane Barrier on this one. However, I think the Crown of Dominion is just a better headpiece between these two, and I think you need to have either one of these two in order to be able to be really competitive in Flesh and Blood in general. So you need to have one of these if you have a hero that utilizes one of these. There are, however, heroes like Ninja that have other pieces available to them, but you need to have something that can block for 2 in the head slot, otherwise you're gonna lose. If your hero has something available that can block 2 that is cheaper, good for you. You should definitely go for that choice instead if you want to play on a budget. But for now, I think this is really it's pretty much a mandatory piece in anything that doesn't have a 2-block head equipment available to them. And the Crown of Dominion, on the other hand, I don't think it's that good, unfortunately. I'm even tempted to put it in the bad category because it's very niche in what it does, but it still does what it does well, so let's leave it at decent and leave it at that. So the Ram set, it's very good in a meta where there's a lot of mechanologists, ninjas and stuff that generally likes to go wide and also breaks the combat chain every now and then. Like against ninjas, maybe a bad example because ninja tends to keep the combat chain going without breaking it. However, if you're up against a mechanologist that has the pistol, you can block with this for 1, then you can, when they activate anything like putting a steam counter or something, the combat chain gets broken, which means that you can block for it again and the +1 counters stay on here. So if you're up against a pistol dash, you can pretty much block out everything they do with just 2 pitch and then just taking 1 damage, and you can just keep on blocking endlessly over and over and over. So I think in that regard the Ram set is great. However, again, I don't think it's a mandatory piece. I think the mandatory shield is probably the Stalagmite instead, because this one puts a frostbite on the opponent's side of the field, which is a lot more potent in most situations, and on top of that this one can block 2 and then 1 without needing like a resource investment, which is a thing that's a bit awkward with the Ram set at time. The Ram set is great in combination with the Crown of Seeds though, but I think this one just punishes so many more heroes out there right now that want to close out the game by turn 2 or 3. Like you can block twice and give them a frostbite both of those times, and that should limit them enough that you can block out the turns easily, and maybe follow it up with some big crush effects during their turn, during your turn, like onto theirs, in order to really cripple them and take over the tempo completely. So I think the Stalagmite is definitely a mandatory piece if you want to be competitive in the Flesh and Blood format. Luckily, the Stalagmite is a lot cheaper than the Ram set, as far as I know. Maybe that has changed in the meantime, but I consider this one a mandatory piece to have because it really hits a lot of heroes. This one is kind of optional. It's good, but not super great. So the New Horizon, I am double-sided about it. Like on the one hand, I feel like having that second arsenal slot is very good. Like it makes a lot of playstyles a lot more potent, especially for decks like Lexi. However, I have found that you can kind of navigate your turns perfectly fine even if you don't have the New Horizon. If you use something like a Honing Hood to put something from your hand into your arsenal, it's also kind of good and gives you a lot of like advantage where you can use Lexi to flip a lightning card and then use the Honing Hood to put it back into your hand, put something else into your arsenal, then you can play that one will go again and stuff like that. So I do think that there are definitely budget alternatives to the New Horizon out there. It's not a must-have legendary, and therefore I will put it into the great category, but it's very close to mandatory. I just feel this one has a lot of very cheap alternatives that are perfectly fine to run instead of it. So if you want to get started with Ranger, get yourself a Honing Hood and you should be more than fine. Of course, this one blocks for 2, but it has that downside that it destroys your arsenal and everything in it. So I think it has a big enough downside not to run it, and on one hand, so I'm not sure. I don't think the New Horizon is that mandatory nowadays. We have the Spellbound Creepers. This is another card that is really great because you can set up a lot of very good combo turns. Like what you can do with a Spellbound Creepers, for example, is that you play an attack and then at instant speed you flash in something like a Minnowism. The Minnowism will become instant, but because it has Go Again printed on the Minnowism, it will still give you the action point that it would normally generate you back by playing it normally. So with the Spellbound Creepers, you can very easily generate additional action points. On top of that, you can pull off some very nice combos in decks like Viserai, because what you can do is like you can play a Revel in Runeblood, assuming that you've already played an attack that turn, and then before the Revel in Runeblood resolves, you can activate your creepers to play a second copy of Revel in Runeblood, and because of the wording on the card, it only checks if another non-attack action has been played, and because the previous one has been played, you get 4 or more rune chants from the one activation, and then when the second one resolves, you get an additional 4 rune chants, so you can kind of trick the rules of Flesh and Blood in order to give you more value than you should, and because of that, the Spellbound Creepers are just a must-have card in most of the Runeblade decks. However, I do feel there is a lot of merit to just running Snapdragon skills instead, simply because with the Snapdragon skills you have a guaranteed Go Again on an attack action card like once in the game, while this is sometimes a bit too situational. Like sometimes you can get a lot of value out of it, sometimes it becomes a bit awkward that you can't really pay for that one resource, especially in decks like Viserai, which makes this a great legendary in my opinion, but again, not a mandatory one. So if you're starting out as a Runeblade, just get yourself some Snapdragon Scalers and you'll be more than fine playing the game. So the Vestige of Soul, I actually think it's a bad legendary. And maybe, like, I've seen some Prisms that pulled it off well. However, it requires so much setup and so much stuff to do in order to really get value out of this. Like, you already need to charge, and then at that point you most likely already pitch something, and then you need to play something that, in order to pitch another thing, it requires too many steps and too many resources to really get some proper value out of this. Therefore, I think it's just a bad legendary and you really shouldn't be playing it. The Phantasmal Footsteps, they are absolutely mandatory in Prism, I would say. However, in Dromai they are not mandatory. I'm gonna put it in the mandatory slot because for Prism it's just a must-have, because if your opponent pops your Phantasms with a 6 attack and you just have to end the turn on the spot there, you're just completely screwed. So in the Blitz format, you really need to have this card, on top of it having the flexibility that you can block some awkward damage points without losing a card in your deck. So I do think it's mandatory. However, if you're a Dromai player, I think the Silent Stilettos are perfectly fine as an alternative. There are probably some other cards out there that you could use instead as well. So for Prism, mandatory. For Dromai, it's great, but not mandatory. The Valiant Dynamos for Kasai and for Kasai and anything that wants to use 2 weapons. So for like the newer Dorinthia attacks out there that utilize the Decker, I think the Valiant Dynamos is a huge source of value in both CC and Blitz. So I think decks that utilize 2 weapons, this definitely becomes a mandatory card simply because of how much value it can generate over the course of a game. However, in case of like Dorinthia and such, because you have alternative playstyles available to Dorinthia, like instead of using 2 weapons you can use the Dawnblade, then you do have that common available to you, the, what's it called again? Why is the name completely fading my mind? But basically, when you hit with a weapon, you can crack the item in order to give it Go Again. So I do think that the Valiant Dynamos are really a must-have in decks like Kasai. However, in Dorinthia, you can kind of build your deck differently that you don't really need those. So in Kasai, it's definitely a mandatory card. However, for Dorinthia, and I guess to some extent like Bolton as well, because Bolton can do very well with a Snapdragon skills in order to pull off his combo turn properly. Kasai mandatory, everything else is great and there's alternatives available to it. I will keep it in the mandatory slot because there are going to be Kasai players watching this video and I don't want them to get the wrong idea that they don't need this card. The Carrion Husk. Carrion Husk is probably the best card that Chain has. It really lets it generate so much value in the Blitz format that I really like that legendary. I think it's a great legendary. Do I think it's mandatory? I don't think it's mandatory because we have 8 Iron Weave available to us, which can generate 2 resources, which can also be very potent to set up a big aggro combo turn. So I do think it's a great card. If you have it, you should definitely use it. But if you don't have it, don't be afraid. The 8 Iron Weave is perfectly fine. It just changes the flow of the game a little bit because you need to be a little bit more defensive with the cards in your hand, but then when you do have like that solid turn available to you, then you can just go with your non-attack, go with your attack with go again, crack the 8 Iron Weave, and then just gain 2 resources and just keep your flow of things going that way. So it's a great card, but again, not a mandatory one. So if you're starting out as a Chain player in Blitz, don't buy this straight away. Try the deck out first with an 8 Iron Weave, and then if you really like the deck, you can always buy this one later on. Doomsday is a bit of a weird card. Like on the one hand, it does what it does. However, we haven't really seen Levaya doing all that well in general, and I think Levaya with all the blood tap stuff, like in my personal opinion, it's a bit dangerous to have too much blood depth in your deck in general, because you can very easily get into a situation that your opponent forces you to discard a bunch of stuff, especially after you've already blocked, and then if you cannot attack and you cannot banish that 6 attack in order to turn the blood depth off, you just straight up lose the game. So I think this one so situational, and it can really get you in trouble if you build your deck too heavily favored towards blood depth. So I will just put it in bad for now and just leave it there. Eclipse in Blitz right now, it's not usable. It's just not really possible to pitch stack to a degree that you can pull the Eclipse off consistently. When Chain was still legal in the CC format, however, it was so good because you can set up these big turns with like 7 Soul Shackles, having a lot of blood depth going off into the banish zone that you can play that turn. It was just so good, and I want to put it in great. However, because we don't have a Chain deck available right now, we only have the Blitz Chain, I have to put it into the don't play section, simply because we don't have a Chain that can utilize it right now. We don't have a Shadow Hero in general that can really take advantage of this. Like, yeah, Shiana can use it, but Shiana doesn't have enough blood depth available to it to be able to pull this off, so I need to put it here, which is very sad, but it's just the way it is until we get a new Chain. Once we have a new Chain, it's probably gonna shoot up to maybe even mandatory level, so... but I need to put it here for now. For Wizard players, the Stormstriders, they are unfortunately... for Kano, it's definitely a mandatory piece. For Icelander, not so much. Like, Icelander is fine just playing the control plan a little bit longer and just doing stuff during her turn. So for Icelander, it's great, but not mandatory. For Kano, it's definitely a mandatory card. So if you're a Kano player, you need to be ready to pick one of these up. There's just no way around it. It's just too important of a card to be able to play a deck properly. Therefore, it is in the mandatory slot, unfortunately. The Skullbone cross wrappings, I'm not sure about this one. I like the opt. I think for Azalea it's maybe even mandatory, but I've seen Azalea decks that play around with things like the Honing Hood and the New Horizon as well. So I think it's decent, but not mandatory. The opt is great, however, we have so many cards available to us nowadays that allow us to opt by just playing them, that I think that Azalea in general is in a spot now that she doesn't really need this specific opt anymore, which makes it a decent card to have. It has Arcane Barrier as well, which is really good, but it's not mandatory anymore, which is probably good in general. The Foundry Heart, this one is definitely a great card, maybe even mandatory for, yeah, I think it's definitely mandatory for for Mechanologist, because on the one hand it allows you to block a bunch of damage. Blocking 3 damage is a lot for Mechanologist, and it's one of the few heroes that has a 3 block chess piece available to them. Like Mechanologist, actually I think it's the only one that has one. No, Draconic also has one of those available to it. Anything else? No, I think that's it. I think Draconic and Draconic heroes and Mechanologist heroes are the only ones that have like a 3 block chess piece available to them. But the good thing about this is, like, if you're really in resource trouble, you can very easily activate this, banish 2 things in order to get an additional resource back. So you can turn 1 resource into 2 resources, which is just very powerful and can really help you to close out games where normally you wouldn't be able to. So therefore I do consider it a mandatory legendary, and I put it up here. It's just very good, a very good thing to have. The Grasp of the Arknight. This is a tough one, because I feel equipment pieces that can block 3 damage almost become mandatory, and I think right now for Runeblade, I don't think they have anything available to them that is an alternative to this. So I do think that the Grasp of the Arknight is a mandatory piece to have for Runeblade players. There's just nothing that really does what this does. Like, it helps you to set up a rune charm that blocks 3 damage. It just keeps on generating value throughout the whole game with very minimal setup in general. So I do definitely think this is a mandatory card to have. There's just no way around it. It's just the way it is. So the Braveforge Braces, I will put it in the great slot because we do have the Gallantry Gold from Monarch available to us. Like, both of these have an upside. Like the Braveforge Braces, they can block that additional 2 damage, but the Gallantry Gold really help in those really go-wide turns. I think for Dorinthia, using a Dawnblade, this is probably a mandatory piece. I would suggest, if you're gonna play Dorinthia, pick up a foreign copy of this. Like Italian Braveforge Braces, they are only like $30 each, if I'm not mistaken. They're very affordable to pick up, so definitely do it for the extra block value. However, if you are starting out, the Gallantry Gold is a perfect alternative. You can just go with that and you should be more than fine. Therefore, I will put this one in the great slot instead of the mandatory slot, and yeah, I'll just leave it at there. The Fiendal Spring Tunic, this one is controversial because a lot of people will tell you it's mandatory. From personal experience though, I feel there is plenty of alternatives to the Fiendal Spring Tunic out there. Like in CC, where the games last long, of course, like if you're up against a control hero, then this almost becomes like a mandatory piece. But I feel if you're playing a deck like an aggro deck, for example, that goes up against a control deck, you're most likely going to be losing that matchup anyways. So then the question becomes, as a new player, do you want to really invest that 200 to have a slightly better winning chance against those decks, or do you just accept the fact that your aggro deck is pretty much trying to win by turn 3 or 4 and that's it? Because if so, things like Blossom of Spring are a great alternative. If you're playing a wizard hero, you can get like the new wizard chess piece from, I think it's from Uprising, that generates 1 resource during the opponent's turn, which is a great alternative for a Kano player. So I don't think it's mandatory anymore. We have plenty of alternatives out there available to us now, and if you're starting out, don't start by getting this expensive piece. Just build your deck properly first and just get one of the alternative commons instead, and then later on, once you are more footed into the Flesh and Blood format, you can always upgrade to a Fiendal Spring Tunic, but in the beginning, I don't think you really need it. So the Tectonic Plating, this is another one that blocks for 3. Like earlier, I mentioned only this and Mecha piece, where we also have the Tectonic Plating. Most Guardian players nowadays, they run Fiendal Spring Tunic because they do have several activations during the opponent's turn. That extra 1 resource during their turn can be very valuable to them. However, as an alternative piece, like this one blocks more against all the physical oriented heroes, and it can still get you that extra value by pitching a card, getting a Seismic Surge token to make your attacks during your going off turn bigger. So there's definitely merit to running this card over the Fiendal Spring Tunic. So do I think it's mandatory? Not really, because, well, because these are kind of interchangeable within the Guardian hero in general. I would say like if you're playing Guardian, you definitely need either this one or this one, because there's not really an alternative piece for you out there right now. However, for now, I think it's a great but not mandatory piece, and I'll just leave it here for the time being. The Scab skins, again, it's a great piece, but we have beaten trackers available to us, so we have alternative ways to generate additional combo points. For Levi, you also have the Shadow who's available to you, so again, it's a great legendary, but not a mandatory one. For Icelander, we have the Coronet Peak here. I think the Coronet Peak, it's a bit of a weird thing. Like if you have a Crown of Providence available to you, then it becomes great. Like both of these have their upsides. However, if you don't have a Crown of Providence, you do need a good equipment in your head slot, and I think like having the Coronet Peak is one of those pieces that's just a must-have for Iceland in general if you don't have a different 2-block available to you. The reason is that the Coronet Peak allows you to kind of set up turns where you block with 3 cards from your hand, use your arsenal during your turn, or like keep your arsenal for your next turn, and then use your last card in your hand to be able to activate that action and forcing the opponent to discard something and making it easier to block their stuff during their next turn. So I think the Coronet Peak is really a mandatory piece to have because of that discard effect, and it just lets you generate value out of turns that normally you wouldn't be able to. So I think it's really a mandatory piece to have. You just need to have it in your Icelander equipment arsenal, otherwise you're really going to be losing quite a few games that normally you wouldn't be. I think this is probably the most important equipment for Iceland in general, so if you need to choose one legendary for your Icelander deck, go for the Coronet Peak. It's just a very good thing to have. Massive Momentum, I think like it used to be a mandatory thing to have. However, nowadays, because we have the Master of the Pouncing Links available to us, which is a much cheaper alternative that can kind of get you a similar amount of damage by being able to pick which card you get out of your deck. So in the Blitz format, this is definitely a mandatory piece to have if you run a Ninja deck, so I will put it up in mandatory for the time being. However, if you're in CC, it becomes great. So it's only mandatory in Blitz to have this if you run a Ninja deck. In CC, it's not really that important. You can just run the Monster Pouncing Links and you should be more than fine. So the Flame Skill Furnace, like this one is one of those cards that is just very good to have, especially in Blitz. It blocks 3, it lets you generate extra resources if you have a full red hand, so it's definitely a very solid and important card to have. However, I noticed that the decks that do utilize this, I think for Dromai and such, it's probably mandatory simply because that activation also generates Ash for them. However, I think for every other deck there are alternatives out there. I will put it in mandatory simply because it's very good in the Dromai deck. However, if you're not playing Dromai, you're playing a go wide aggro deck like Fi, then you can definitely go with something like a Blossom of Spring. I think for the Emperor, this one is also a mandatory piece because the Emperor has that downside that it can only run red cards in its deck, and you really need to Flame Skill Furnace in order to be able to generate like 3 resources with just 2 cards. Otherwise you can kind of get screwed, and this one helps you to avoid that. So it's a very good piece to have. There's a lot of value to be had for Dromai and the Emperor, but for everything else it's probably a great tier legendary. The Ghostly Touch, I haven't really seen anyone be able to get enough value out of this, therefore I put it into the bad tier, maybe even the don't play tier. Like I don't think it's worth running the Ghostly Touch, to be honest. And the thing is, like, it's nice that every time a Phantasm gets popped that you get to put a counter on here, but I don't like the fact that you need to remove a counter in order to activate it to be able to attack in with it. It just requires too many counters before this one becomes anywhere near viable to play, so therefore I put it into the don't play slot. And then finally we have the Tiger Stripe Shuko. This is it's a tough one. Like for Ira and Katsu, you can definitely just play the breaking skills instead. They are perfectly fine. However, for Fi, do I think it's mandatory? That's a tough one. We have the heat wave available to us if you run multiple Phoenix Flames, which is quite nice and can get you a lot of value. But this one can get you attack value on top of being able to block too. And I think for a deck like Fi, it's probably a mandatory card to have, simply because you are able to block so much value with this, but that's mostly for the Blitz format. In Blitz I would consider this mandatory. In CC on the other hand, in CC we have a much larger breaking point available to us, so in CC it's a great card to have but not mandatory, because we have other things that can block as well and can generate some value for us. But in Blitz it is definitely mandatory. Therefore I do think, as you might have seen from this video, like a lot of these pieces that they end up putting into mandatory are mainly focused on Blitz in general, because in the CC format they are not as mandatory as they are in Blitz. And I think because of that, if you want to get started in Flesh and Blood, I know a lot of newer players, they tend to gravitate towards the Blitz format because you only need like 2 of each card available in your deck. However, I think that it's far easier to build a budget deck in CC that's going to perform very well than it is in Blitz, because Blitz you start at such a low life total that it becomes almost very difficult to be able to leverage your turns well. Your opponent can really overwhelm you easily and it may be a bad experience for you. Therefore, I suggest, if you need to choose a format, it's probably better to start with CC, because you have a higher life total, you have a bit more time to set up your plays, to get familiar with the flow of the game and stuff like that, and you will just have a good time in general. So this would be my list for the Blitz format. If I have to adjust this one for CC, well then the Flamescale Furnace probably, well, it's still mandatory for Dramai I guess, but this one will become great. The Muzzle Momentum will become great because we have the Muzzle of the Pouncing Lings available to us. The Valiant Dynamos, well, we don't have Kasai in CC, so Kasai wouldn't really need the Valiant Dynamos, and the other warrior heroes, they have different leg pieces available to them, so this one will become a great piece as well. The Phantasmal Footsteps, they're only really important for Prism. We don't have a Prism in CC right now, so this one will become great as well. What else do we have here then? So that wouldn't be up here if we were in a Blitz, in a CC format. Yeah, I think this is about right. I guess this one probably could be replaced if you really want to with something else that generates resources, but it's just a good piece in general. So for CC, I would say my tier list would look something like this. And for the Blitz format, well, it's the one that I showed earlier with these 4 being up here as well. But yeah, that's pretty much all for today. If you want me to do a video with alternatives for a specific legendary in this list, let's do it like this. Leave a comment down below which legendary you want me to cover, and I will do a follow-up video where I explain all the interactions and all the alternatives out there that you can use for each hero. And then that's pretty much it. And other than that, thank you for watching. I hope this video was useful to you, and I hope to see you all very, very soon with another Flesh and Blood video. Take care.